Sup dogs, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're talking about Linda Zagzebski's article, Omniscience, Time, and Freedom. The central question that we're going to be investigating here is whether or not divine foreknowledge is compatible with human freedom. Right? This is a deeply significant question. God's existence, after all, might be on the line, right? Consider the following argument. Premise 1, if God exists, then God enjoys infallible foreknowledge. We would think that if God's foreknowledge is fallible, well then surely God isn't a perfect being. God could be wrong. That seems really whack, doesn't it? But if God doesn't know things in advance, if he doesn't know what's happening in advance, he would seem to be ignorant of something, right? Surely there are truths about the future, right? For any proposition that you can specify, for any meaningful declarative sentence, surely it's either true or it's false. And surely, then, God either knows whether or not it's true and whether or not it's false. So, premise 1 seems reasonably plausible. If God exists, then God enjoys infallible foreknowledge. He knows things in advance of their occurring. So, premise 1 seems on good footing, doesn't it? And then premise 2, let's look at that now. If God enjoys infallible foreknowledge, then no human acts freely. But, so the argument goes, some humans do act freely, right? And therefore, God doesn't exist. So God's existence might be on the line. That's why this is important. Now, in Zagzebski's article, she's basically just exploring premise 2 of this above argument, which is a premise committing to theological fatalism. Now, before proceeding with Zagzebski's analysis and exploration of premise 2 in this argument, I do want to say something on behalf of premise 3, that some humans act freely. I guess the best line of evidence that people give for this is just that it seems obvious. It seems almost self-evident, doesn't it? We blame people. We praise people. We hold them responsible, and none of that seems to make any sense, apart from the fact that humans sometimes act freely. We think that Hitler definitely shouldn't have done what he did. We hold them responsible for these sorts of things. We blame them, at least typically. That's a natural thought. That's an intuitive thought. It seems really common sense. That can only be the case if some humans act freely on some occasions. That's the basic thrust behind 3. There are other arguments for it and so on, but the basic idea is just that it just seems really obvious. And now let's move on to Zagzebski's exploration of premise 2. So the argument for premise 2, again, look at premise 2, if God enjoys infallible foreknowledge, then no human acts freely. In other words, infallible divine foreknowledge is incompatible with human freedom. That's essentially what premise 2 is saying. The argument for premise 2 rests on a conjunction of 4 theses. First, infallible foreknowledge. So God is infallibly omniscient. That is, God cannot be wrong, and he knows every truth about the future in advance of the future's happening, that is. The second thesis is the necessity of the past. It's this intuitive idea, or at least what purports to be intuitive, that the past is fixed and unalterable. It enjoys now necessity, which is the type of necessity that the past has just because it is past. Things in the past just seem over and done with, right? They seem out of our control in some sense. There's no use crying over spilled milk, as the adage says. It's already done. It already happened, right? It's gone. It's receded into the past. There's nothing you can do about it now. And so in that sense, the past just seems fixed. It seems unalterable. In fact, I'm now going to turn it over to Linda Zagzebski herself to explain this premise here. And this is actually drawn from a podcast episode that she did on the Free Will Show, which I highly recommend. I've got links in the description. But anyway, let's hear her talk about the necessity of the past.
Another term that I think is important in order to understand this argument has to do with temporal necessity. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to say that something is temporally necessary?
Yes, I've used the term temporally necessary. It's really the same as what people call the necessity of the past. So the idea is that everything that happened in the past is now necessary, whether or not it was necessary when it was still future. So the well-known saying, there's no use crying over spilled milk, means that even though you could prevent the milk from spilling before it happens, once it has spilled, there's nothing anybody can do about it. Once an event is in the past, it's beyond our control. So the idea here is that there's a kind of necessity that attaches to time, where events are first contingent, and then after they occur, they become necessary. So that necessity of the past is very important for the argument about theological fatalism, because we're going to talk about God's past knowledge.
So that's the second thesis in the argument for premise 2 above, the argument for theological fatalism. The third thesis is the principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP. Now this says that acting freely requires the ability to do otherwise. In other words, in order to be responsible for something, for performing some action, you had to have had the ability to have done otherwise. Each of 2 or more incompatible courses of action are such that you have the power to perform them. Why might someone believe PAP? Well, one thought is that we seem to hold others morally responsible, right? We seem to say something along the lines of, Hitler ought not to have killed millions or orchestrated the killing of millions. The 20th century Soviet Union should not have thrown people in the gulags, and so on. Maybe some people, no, I'm kidding. That was a joke. And, if you got punched by someone else and when they were in a fit of rage or something like that, you say, no, you shouldn't have done that. Why did you do that to me, right? You should not have done that. You ought not to have done that. We say things like that. And it seems really intuitive. It seems really plausible that things like that are true. How could those be true, though, if the people in question couldn't have done otherwise? Well, it's at least plausible prima facie that ought implies can. That is, if someone ought to do something or to have done something, well then they could have done that thing. They have the ability to have done that thing. And so, if it's true that I ought to have done something different, or that Hitler ought to have done something different with his life, which surely he should have, then it follows that we could have done something different with our lives. We could have done otherwise. We do have the ability to do otherwise. So that's something that motivates some people to think that the principle of alternative possibilities is true. I'm not here to defend PAP. I'm just sketching the motivations that some people have in favor of it. Now, why might we think that ought implies can? Well, if I was tied to a chair, right, I can't save someone that's, let's say, 30 yards away from me in the same room because I'm tied to a chair. Suppose it's not really easy for me to get out and maybe I'm chained to it or something. So I can't get out of my chair. It would be really strange for someone to be like, oh, no, you ought to have saved that person over there. Like, what? No, I couldn't have. Or you ought to be able to fly. What if someone told you that? You ought to be able to fly. What's going to be your response? Your response is going to be something along the lines of, what are you talking about? I can't fly, right? And that's why it's false that I ought to fly. I'm a poet, and I didn't know it. I'm dropping rhymes all the time. Anyway, that's PAP. There's much more that can be said here, and the debates here are huge, and I'll probably get to those at some point in the future on my channel. But let's move to the fourth principle that's driving the argument for theological fatalism. And I'm going to spell out this argument soon, right? So I'm just laying down the 4 theses on the table before I go into the argument. Now, this fourth thesis is the transfer of necessity principle. The idea is that if it's necessarily the case, so a box, that just means it is necessarily the case that, or necessarily. So if it's necessarily the case that P implies Q, right? So if it's necessarily the case that if P then Q, and if P is now necessary, well then it follows that Q is now necessary, right? So what we're saying here is that if P entails Q, if it's necessarily the case that P implies Q, and P is now necessary, well then it simply follows that Q is now necessary. And that seems really plausible, right? Let's actually hear Linda Zagzebski herself talk about the plausibility of this.
What's sometimes called the transfer of necessity principle. Could you give an explanation of that principle?
Yes, it's much easier to explain the transfer of necessity if you can write it up, but it's actually fairly simple. It's a logical principle that is actually part of the logics of necessity, of what people call modal logic. And schematically, the principle's this. If some proposition P is necessary, and it's also necessary that if P then Q is necessary. So here's an example. It's necessary that 5 is a positive integer. It's also necessary that if 5 is a positive integer, then 5 is greater than 0. Therefore, it's necessary that 5 is greater than 0. Now, this principle is, as I said, it's an axiom of every system of modal logic, the logic of necessity. The principle is supposed to tell us in part what necessity means. So this transfer of necessity, if P is necessary, and if it's necessary that if P then Q is necessary, that seems to be just indisputable when you're talking about logical necessity, the kind of necessity that applies, say, to mathematics, as in the example I gave. But in the argument about foreknowledge and in other sorts of arguments, like about causal determinism, there's other kinds of necessity that are being discussed. And then people use a transfer of necessity principle. It's not a transfer of logical necessity, but in this case, it's a transfer of the temporal necessity or the necessity of the past. So the intuitive idea of the transfer of necessity is pretty strong. The question is, does it apply to all forms of necessity? Does it apply to, in particular, does it apply to the necessity of the past?
All right, so we have the 4 principles down, and now we can look at the argument itself, the argument for theological fatalism. The argument goes as follows. So if one is true, right, if God has infallible foreknowledge such that God cannot be wrong, well then for any proposition P that reports some subject S's action performed today, so action that could be phi, so maybe S punched someone, or S ate too many cookies, or whatever, some action that S performed. So if one is true, if God is infallibly omniscient, well then for any proposition P reporting S's action phi performed today or in the future, God believed P in the past. Since God is infallibly omniscient, God's believing P in the past necessarily implies P, right? This is just to say that it cannot be the case, both that God believes P and yet P is false, right? So necessarily, if God believes P in the past, then P. Okay, that's all that this is saying. God's believing P in the past necessarily implies P. Now, by 4, the transfer of necessity principle, it follows that if God's believing P in the past is now necessary, well then P is now necessary. God's believing P in the past necessarily implies P. So look at the transfer of necessity principle. We actually have this necessary entailment relation between one proposition and another. Namely, in this case, God's believing that P and P's being true, because there's a necessary implication there. And if that's the case, if we have this part of this antecedent satisfied, well then we can say that, okay, if God's believing that P is now necessary, well then the consequent is also now necessary, which is just P itself, right? Our necessary implication was given by God's infallible omniscience, right? God's believing P in the past necessarily implies P. And so we can use the transfer of necessity principle to infer that if God's believing P in the past is itself now necessary, well then P is now necessary, because we have that necessary implication and we have the antecedent being necessary. And from that we can infer from the transfer of necessity principle that the consequent is also now necessary. Now, by thesis 2, the necessity of the past, God's believing P in the past, precisely because it occurred in the past, is now necessary, right? That's what the necessity of the past principle says. And hence, P is now necessary, right? We just affirmed that the antecedent is now necessary because God believed that P in the past. And we got that necessary connection between God's believing that P in the past and P itself. And so we use the transfer of necessity principle to infer that P itself is now necessary. So that's what we're getting at here. But if P itself is now necessary, well then clearly S cannot do otherwise than phi today, right? There's nothing anyone can do about P today if P is now necessary, right? Remember, that's a kind of fixed and an unalterable kind of necessity that we're talking about, the now necessity. And so S cannot do otherwise than phi today. And by 3, by the principle of alternative possibilities, it follows that for any S and any action phi, S is not free in doing phi today, right? Because these are just arbitrary variables that we let to pick out any agent and any action performed today or in the future. And therein lies the incompatibility, or at least purported incompatibility, between human freedom on the one hand and infallible omniscience on the other. So that's my summary of the argument, and let's hear Linda Zagzebski herself summarize the argument, because she does it more simply. She doesn't show all the precise connections among the 4 theses. That's really what I wanted to do here, but she does state it really well. So let's listen to her.
Assume that there is a God who knew infallibly thousands of years ago that I would go to Norman on a certain day, say September 1st, 2020. Now, since the belief is in the past, it has the necessity of the past. I can't make it not have happened. And since God is infallible, I cannot make the belief false. But by the transfer of necessity, if it's now necessary that God had that belief, and necessarily if God had the belief, then the belief is true. It's now necessary that the belief is true. And that means that my future act has the same necessity that the past has. It's now necessary. And then looks like I cannot do otherwise than to go to Norman on a certain day. But if I can't do otherwise than to go to Norman on that day, then it looks like I will not go to Norman freely. And similarly, for every act I perform, every act you perform, nothing anybody does seems to happen of their own free will, under this assumption that God had infallible foreknowledge in the past.
All right, so that then is the argument for theological fatalism, and hence the argument for premise 2. We've already seen how premise 3 and premise 1 are really plausible, and this argument isn't like bonkers here, right? I mean, it's not like an absurd argument, and so this is a really interesting argument that you guys should think about. So now let's continue with Zagzebski's paper. Remember, I'm giving a kind of summary, an exploration, and some additions of my own, but I'm basically giving a summary of Zagzebski's paper, which, again, you can find in the description. So basically, in the next portion of her paper, after spelling out the argument and the theses and so on, she considers how each of these theses, 1 through 4, might be weakened or modified while preserving the argument's validity and force. Now, regarding 1, she argues that all that's required is actually the mere possibility of infallible belief in the relevant propositions. She argues that on, well, that's what these numbers are, by the way, the page numbers that she argues it. Regarding thesis 2, she argues that it might be modified to preserve the argument's force even if God is timeless, since the timeless realm seems equally determinate and fixed as the past. I mean, just as there's no use crying over spilled milk, she says, there's no use crying over timelessly spilling milk. I think the idea here really is that how does shifting the beliefs into the timeless realm help? I mean, it's still true 1,000 years ago, say, that the timeless realm is as it is. I mean, timelessness, that's unchangeability. That's like a hallmark of unalterability, right? And so that just seems to be equally determinate and as fixed as the past is, right? Perhaps even more so. If there's no use crying over spilled milk, surely there's also no use crying over timelessly spilling milk. I mean, even 1,000 years ago it was timelessly spilling as well, and it just seems like there's nothing you're going to be able to do to change that. Now, regarding this timelessness response, Peter Van Inwagen also gives a case of a stone monument. Even if God is timeless, he could still, create a stone monument thousands of years ago, say, and infallibly inscribe on it every precise thing that you're going to do in your life, say. And in that case, appealing to timelessness won't actually help, right? Because this stone monument, the engravings on it and so on, and the fact that it was engraved by an infallibly omniscient being, that's actually all in the past, right? The stone monument is itself a temporal thing. So in that case, it doesn't really actually matter if God's beliefs and so on are in this timeless realm. What matters is the fact that there's a kind of fixity here. There's a kind of determinacy and unalterability. And I think PVI, Peter Van Inwagen, he kind of brings that out with his stone monument case. Even if God is timeless, clearly God could make such a stone. And if God does that, well then the stone is quite literally part of the past. Your actions are written in stone. Literally and figuratively here, aren't they? Overall then, there just doesn't really seem to be a swift and simple way to avoid theological fatalism, or at least this theological fatalist argument, by appeal to timeless beliefs and so on. Firstly, the timeless realm seems just as fixed and unalterable as the past, and secondly, you've Peter Van Inwagen's stone case, which shows that timelessness really isn't really doing any of the work here, because even if God is timeless, we still have this case of things in the past being able to be there and threaten our freedom thereby. Let's move on to what she says regarding thesis 3. So, regarding that thesis, she says that the argument for fatalism can be recast in agent causal terms without PAP. So actually, PAP is not utterly necessary to this argument. You can actually cast it in agent causal terms. Since, as she argues on pages 8 to 11, alternative possibilities, unlike agent causation, are subsidiary to what's required for free will. And the basic idea is just that if it's now necessary that S do phi, well then S does not agent cause S's act of phi-ing. So that's a basic idea behind the alteration in terms of agent causation instead of just PAP. And then regarding thesis 4, Zagzebski derives a transfer of contingency principle from the transfer of necessity principle. So this is actually quite important because this raises some suspicions, as she argues, about the very idea of this kind of temporal necessity and possibility, temporal modality, and in particular the asymmetry of time's modality, the past being necessary and the future being contingent. So this is regarding thesis 4, again, the transfer of necessity principle. So she argues that if we do grant this transfer of necessity principle, well, then we're also going to have to grant a transfer of contingency principle. And that's going to actually spell some, as I was just alluding to, it's going to spell some difficulties for the idea that time is modally asymmetrical, that the past is necessary while the future is contingent, or at least now contingent and now necessary. So let's go through her derivation. Here's a definition, right? P is now contingent. What that means is that P, the truth of P, some proposition, that's now possible, but also its falsity is now possible. So it's like, it's both possibly true, but also possibly false. And instead of possibly in the sense of logical or metaphysical possibility, it's this kind of now possibility. So that's the possibility and necessity and so on, the modalities that attach to time, right? We're talking about sort of temporal possibilities and temporal necessities and so on. So here's the transfer of contingency principle that we're going to try to derive using the transfer of necessity principle up above. So the transfer of contingency principle says that if it's necessarily the case that P implies Q, it's easier to say that if P entails Q, right? Because that's a kind of like a necessary implication. So if P entails Q, and P is now possible while Q is now contingent, well then P itself is now contingent. Another way to think about that is that if P necessarily implies Q, and P is now possible while Q is now contingent, well then P itself can't be now necessary, right? If P were itself now necessary, well then we'd have necessarily P entails Q, and we would have necessarily, now I know it's now necessity, but I'm just saying necessarily to make it easier here. We would have necessarily P implies Q, and we would have P being now necessary, right? And per the transfer of necessity principle, that strictly entails that Q itself would be now necessary. But we're supposing that Q is now contingent, and hence our original assumption that P is now necessary is false. So that's the basic idea behind the argument, behind the derivation, okay? So I basically just gave a derivation, right? But I can give a more formal derivation below. And so to those of you who don't quite like logic, bear with me. I'm gonna explain this as best as I can. I'm just gonna show you how we get the transfer of contingency principle from the transfer of necessity principle. So here's the transfer of necessity principle, remember. If P entails Q, and P itself is now necessary, well then Q itself is now necessary. We're going to prove a conditional claim here. We're going to suppose that Q is now contingent, right? Because look, we've got a conditional here. So what we want to do is we're going to want to suppose this, and eventually suppose each of these, and then be able to derive this P. We want to be able to derive this here, that P is now contingent. Okay, so we've got our supposition here, and we've got the transfer of necessity principle. So we're supposing that Q is now contingent. Now, what follows from that is that Q is not now necessary, right? To be now contingent is in part to be not now necessary. So then, because Q is not now necessary, well then, look, this is false. Q is not now necessary. And so we can use modus tollens to infer that this whole antecedent is false, right? This whole antecedent is false. And when you have a false conjunction, right, that means that either this one is false or this one is false, right? If you have a false conjunction, either this one's false or this one's false. So we can infer that either it's false that there's that entailment relation, or it's false that P is now necessary. See, this isn't too difficult. I hope you're still with me. Now, let's look at that latter disjunct, right? P is now necessary is false. Well, if that's the case, right, if it's false that P is now necessary, well then obviously either P is now impossible or P is now contingent, right? The only way that something could fail to be now necessary, or think about it like this, the only way something could fail to be necessary is if it's either impossible or it's contingent, right? These are the only really things. Like, if something's neither impossible nor necessary, well then it's going to be contingent automatically. Now, given that this follows from this disjunct, we can plug this in up here, right? So we just plug in what I'm highlighting here for this, okay? So that's what we're doing here. We just plug that in, and so now we conclude that either it's false that there's this entailment relation, or P is now impossible, right? That comes from here, or P is now contingent. So here's the other supposition, right? So we supposed that Q is now contingent. That's one supposition that we want for our conditional proof. And now we're going to assume that this is in fact true, and this is also in fact true. So suppose that, yeah, that entailment claim is actually true. It's not false. And also, P is now possible. Well, then we can actually infer from these two here that P is now contingent, right? P is now contingent because, look, we suppose that this is in fact true. So we can kind of like cross this off from the disjunct. And P is now possible. So we can cross this off, right? P is not now impossible. And so we can actually infer that this third disjunct must be true. So P is now contingent. So we just concluded that P is now contingent, right? And so now we can say that so if Q is now contingent, and if these two are the case, well then we can derive that P is now contingent. And so that is the derivation of the transfer of contingency principle from the transfer of necessity principle. I'm sorry, I'm not actually sorry. This is fun, right? This is sort of like logic and stuff. For those of you who want to be able to see things, right? Just not take it on someone's word, but to be able to see it, confirm it with your mind, with reason, with the majesty of reason. This is for you. So yeah, there's a little QED, quod erat demonstratum. Yes, there's like a 99% chance that I pronounced that wrong. I don't take Latin. Anyway, Zagzebski then develops a counterfatalist argument that employs the intuition that the future is now contingent. So what she's doing is she's developing a counterfatalist argument, right? We have a fatalist argument up here, which relied on the notion that, hey, the past has this now necessity, and we use the transfer of necessity principle. But let's develop a counterfatalist argument, right? We can use the transfer of contingency principle in conjunction with the intuition that the future is now contingent, right? So once we use that, we can actually derive that the past is likewise now contingent, right? Because it's necessarily the case that if God, well, we can return to the God example. If God believed that P in the past, well then it just follows that P, right? Because God is infallibly omniscient. And it's possible that God believed that in the past. In fact, we can even suppose that it's actual. And, right, because Q in this case is something about the future, but Q is really P in this case, so it's kind of like Inception. But anyway, we have God believing that P, and then P, which is some statement about the future. We're going to assume that that's contingent, right? Because we're using the intuition that the future is now contingent. The future seems open in a way that the past isn't. And so, given that we now have the consequent being now contingent, namely the truth that P, and we have a necessary implication between God's believing that P and P itself, and given that the antecedent is itself possible, it just follows that the antecedent there is now contingent, right? It's actually now contingent, God's belief in the past. So we can actually infer that the past things are now contingent. So, I mean, look at this. We have a transfer of necessity principle combined with the necessity of the past. That gives us that, like, all of time, essentially, is necessary. Given, of course, that there is an infallible foreknower. But also, moreover, given the transfer of contingency principle, and given the fact that, or given the intuition that the future, unlike the past, is now contingent, the flip side of that intuition, the flip side of that coin, well then we can actually infer that all of time is now contingent, right? So we have two competing arguments, a fatalist argument and a counter-fatalist argument. And both of these do seem kind of equally forceful. I mean, the future, we seem to have an intuition that is open in a way that the past isn't. Each of incompatible courses of action genuinely seem open for us to pursue, whereas that doesn't seem to be the case for something like the American Revolution or something, right? That seems like an unalterable fixed thing about the past. So, like, the intuitions seem equally, roughly strong, and the transfer of contingency and necessity principle, they go together, right? One entails the other. So, according to Zagzebski, she argues that the fact that both of these arguments are equally forceful and they give us completely contradictory conclusions, that should make us suspect a problem in the notion of temporally relative modality. Now, Zagzebski then argues that an essentially omniscient foreknower, or EOF, which I will assume for ease of exposition necessarily exists, is incompatible with the modal asymmetry of time. For if the past is now necessary, well then, the essentially omniscient foreknower's past beliefs are now necessary. Now, for any P, right, for any proposition P, either EOF believed P or else EOF believed not P. We're here assuming the law of excluded middle. So, for any P, either EOF believed P or else EOF believed not P, right? Because either P is true or else not P is true, these claims about the future. And so, either it's the case that EOF believed P, in the case that P is true, or else EOF believed not P, in the case that not P is true. Now, since EOF's past beliefs are now necessary, it follows that either it is now necessary that EOF believed P, or else it is now necessary that EOF believed not P. But, since the proposition that EOF believed Q, for any Q, is logically equivalent to Q itself, by logical equivalence we just mean that if Q obtains, well then, obviously EOF is going to believe that Q, because it's not as though EOF is going to be ignorant of it, right? It's an essentially omniscient foreknower. And moreover, if EOF believed Q, well then Q itself is going to be true. So there's a kind of bidirectional implication there. Because again, EOF believed Q. EOF is essentially omniscient. So it's infallible. So it's not like it could be wrong or something like that, right? So it's believing that Q and strictly entails that Q. And moreover, Q's being true strictly entails that it believed it. So since EOF believed Q is logically equivalent to Q for any Q, it actually follows from what I've said earlier that either it is now necessary that P, or else it is now necessary that not P. But that entails that it's false, that both P and not P are now possible, right? It's either now necessary one way, or it's now necessary the other way. It's not the case that both of them are possible, now possible, right? Both P and not P. And in that case, now contingency is utterly vanquished. And again, that's because 1, P is now contingent just in case both P and not P are now possible, and 2, the aforementioned argument universally quantifies over any P. The modal asymmetry of time is therefore incompatible with essential divine omniscience. And then Zagzebski then shows that the argument can equally be run with a given contingent proposition P and a being that is essentially epistemically matched to P. That is, a being such that necessarily the being believes P if and only if P. That is, if and only if P is true. Importantly, this argument here didn't make any use of a transfer of necessity principle, right? We actually just argued that an essentially omniscient foreknower is incompatible with the modal asymmetry of time. So long as you have an essentially omniscient foreknower, this argument shows that it cannot be the case that, let's say, the past is now necessary while the future is now contingent. You can't have that kind of modal asymmetry. Zagzebski then compares the theological fatalist argument with a simple logical fatalist argument. The simple fatalist argument runs as follows. Now, logical fatalism, or at least a simple logical fatalist argument, is typically just trying to take the fact that there are some past truths about the future, and they're trying to derive a fatalist conclusion from that, the mere fact that there are past truths about the future. And so we assume in premise 1 that yesterday it was true that B, so some proposition about the future. Premise 2, this follows from the necessity of the past, it is now necessary that yesterday it was true that B, right? This is a fact about the past, and so if facts about the past have a kind of now necessity, well then it is now necessary that yesterday it was true that B. And then necessarily, if yesterday it was true that B, well then now it's true that B, right? So this follows from the omnitemporality of truth. Now, one little side here, I'm not actually going to get into it, but for those of you who are privy to debates in philosophy of time, we have to have a proviso here, and that proviso is that B is a tense-less statement. So B is not like, today is Wednesday. I mean, obviously, it's not the case that if yesterday it was true that today is Wednesday, well then now it is true that today is Wednesday. Like, no, you can't have 2 Wednesdays in a row. It is Wednesday, my dudes. So anyway, you can't really have things that are tensed truths, like today it is, like that's like a present tense, whereas you can have tenseless, which doesn't say that, something is like genuinely occurring in the present, but rather you're saying that, oh, well, Lincoln is shot at such and such a time at such and such a date. Like, that's always going to be true. That's always true 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years henceforth, and so on. So that's kind of the omnitemporality of truth. But anyway, for any given event, we can actually say that event, like we can give a kind of tenseless description of it. So this is still going to deliver you logical fatalism. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to go into this, but I went into it. This is uncontroversial. If B is itself a tenseless statement, this is obviously true, this premise 3. Premise 4, if P is now necessary, and necessarily P implies Q, well then Q is now necessary. This uses the transfer of necessity principle. So it's now necessary that it is true that B, right? That follows. And if it's now necessary that it's true that B, well then B cannot be false by definition. And if B cannot be false, you cannot do otherwise than choose T tomorrow. Okay, so I think her example was choosing T. That's B. So anyway, but again, you can see how it generalizes to any B. She then argues that the theological fatalist argument that I gave above, that theological fatalist argument, is more plausible than the simple logical fatalist argument, since a past belief is a better candidate than a past truth for being now necessary, right? So, like, what is a past truth? Well, that doesn't really seem to have the kind of robust reality or existence that a past belief does. Like, a past belief, that's something that happened in the past, right? That's like something that's located there, as it were. But like a past truth, I mean, that's not really like an object or thing or happening in the past. Rather, that's just like some kind of description wholly about the future. But like, yeah, sure, beliefs might have some kind of component insofar as they're intentionally directed towards the future, but the very act of believing it, right? That is a kind of event that happened in the past. That's definitely much better of a candidate for something that's now necessary, because it's like spilled milk. It's a mental event. It's a mental act that genuinely happened in the past, that occurred in the past. Unlike truth, truth isn't something that like occur. It's not like the spilling of milk or something. It does seem to be the case that a past belief is a better candidate than a past truth for being now necessary. And given that, we seem to have these problems with the notion of temporally relative modality, she cautions us against trusting untutored intuition in determining modal truths as well as entailment and consistency relations. Now, next she examines 4 responses to her new dilemma between essential omniscience and the modal asymmetry of time. That's the kind of new dilemma that I was describing here. This one didn't make use of a transfer of necessity or contingency principle. This was just arguing that an essentially omniscient foreknower is not compatible with the claim that, let's say, the past is now necessary while the future isn't. If you have an essentially omniscient foreknower, if any time is now necessary, all time is going to be now necessary. And so there cannot be any asymmetry in the temporal modality, in now necessity and now contingency. She examines 4 responses to her dilemma. Between essential omniscience, you could either affirm that, but then you're going to have to give up the modal asymmetry of time, or if you want to keep the modal asymmetry of time, you're going to have to give up essential omniscience. Here are the 4 responses, right? You could say essential omniscience, or at least essential epistemic matching to future contingents, is impossible. Second, you could say that God's past beliefs in future contingents, so like God's past beliefs about things in the future that only contingently happen, you could say that God's past beliefs are themselves now contingent. They're actually not now necessary, right? Because if you look up here, this derivation up here crucially relied on EOF's past beliefs being now necessary. So you could say, and I'm just using God here for the essential omniscient foreknower. So you could say this. You could deny that his past beliefs are now necessary. You could say that the future, like the past, is now necessary, right? So these 2 are basically saying that, hey, time is not modally asymmetrical. Actually, the 4th one is just that temporal modality is incoherent. So these are really the 4 options. She notes that a primary reason people find temporal modality plausible, right? Like when I was speaking earlier, we do seem to kind of, at least intuitively and prima facie, find it plausible that the past enjoys some kind of necessity and the future enjoys some kind of contingency. We have lots of sayings that at least indicate that. She notes that a primary reason people find that kind of temporal modal asymmetry plausible is that they confuse this kind of modality with causal modality. However, according to her, the 2 are actually independent. Our power over events has nothing to do with pastness or futurity per se. It depends upon laws of causality, such as the law that causes precede their effects. Preserving this causal arrow allows us to preserve our everyday intuitions that initially led us to believe in temporal modal asymmetry. So let's hear Dr. Linda Zagzebski herself explain her own preferred solution to this. She's building on this notion of confusing kind of temporal modal asymmetry and temporally modal statements with causal modal asymmetry and causally modal statements. So let's hear her talk about that.
For decades, I have thought that there's something phony about the necessity of the past. Part of what's phony about it is that it's supposed to be a kind of necessity that distinguishes the past from the future. So you imagine time moves along and, the future is contingent, and then once the contingent events occur, they become necessary. But prior to their occurring, they're not all necessary. But the argument for fatalism uses the transfer of necessity principle to argue that the future has the same necessity as the past. Everything is, every event, past, present, future, has the same necessity that spilled milk has. But that makes it look like there's something odd about temporal necessity. Like, does it even exist if it turns out that it isn't a necessity that's distinctive of the past? It turns out it's supposed to be a necessity that all events have, past, present, and future. So it made me wonder whether, what is this necessity of the past? Do we really think there is such a thing? What I think now is that we confuse the so-called necessity of the past with something that's a metaphysical principle, not a logical principle, but a metaphysical principle that causes must precede their effects. There's no backwards causation. So, in other words, you can knock the glass over and that causes the milk to spill. You knock it over first and the milk spills second. You couldn't have the reverse order. Okay? The cause has to come before the effect. Now, here's a question to test what you think about the necessity of the past. Just suppose, for the sake of argument, that there is backwards causation. That's possible. Suppose we have the power to do something that is the cause of something that already happened. Just suppose that. Well, I don't think we have that power, of course, but just suppose we did. If it was possible for a cause to come after the effect, would we say that the past is necessary? Would we say that there's no use crying over spilled milk? I actually doubt it. I mean, you could say, well, I'm just not sure. But that suggests that the necessity of the past might not be necessity that's just about time, but it's about the order of causation, which comes first, their effect. And the principle that a cause must come before its effect, it's not actually necessity. I mean, it isn't clear that actually is a principle that connects with the transfer of necessity principle. Transfer of necessity principle is about necessity, not about causation and the order of it.
So Zagzebski ends the article by emphasizing her core thesis, right? So this is the core thesis that she's defending in her article. Either essential omniscience is impossible, or time is not modally asymmetrical. Which horn one takes here will depend on one's background metaphysical beliefs. But it is interesting that you can argue that if time is modally asymmetrical, if you can try to justify that, well then, an essentially omniscient foreknower, and we already saw how, merely adopting timelessness is not really going to help, that's not going to be possible. So that's really interesting. So what do you think here? Does essential omniscience conflict with time's modal asymmetry? Does divine foreknowledge conflict with free will? Well, let me know in the comments section. Before I end here, I'm just going to give some different notes, right? So her article, again, is in the description, as is 1, the interview I've been drawing clips from, and 2, Zagzebski's excellent Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on foreknowledge and free will. Secondly, check out my playlists, right? What am I doing here? Anyway, check out my playlists. This is the full list of all the playlists that I have right now. So check out my Kalam playlist, my contingency arguments playlist, my ontological arguments playlist, my playlist on abstract objects and how they relate to theism, my playlist on the argument from change, the moral argument, different response videos, classical theism, divine attributes, existential inertia, philosophy compass, discussions with philosophers, and finally channel things like updates and so on. So definitely check out the playlists. I recently organized them, so they've got all the videos and stuff that I've done on each of the respective topics within the respective playlists. So, and some of them, of course, overlap, because in some videos I touch on multiple topics. And then you can also check out my new website, right? josephschmid.com. Wow. Joseph, oh yes. Anyway, you can see all my papers on there, plus research updates, and my blog is now located there. So definitely check that out. Link is in the doobly-doo. Okay, and then 4, if my show has served you, consider supporting me on Patreon or through a one-time donation, right? I put a lot of effort into these videos with editing and researching and writing and filming, and I don't run ads on my channel and so on, or at least I haven't monetized it because I care about the viewer experience, right? I don't want to put you guys through that because I don't enjoy ads. And so if you see value in the work that I do, if my show has served you, if you've learned things, consider supporting me on Patreon or through a one-time donation. Think of it like putting my hat out at the end of some kind of performance, right? Like a violin thing on the street. People can just come by and give a one-time donation or something. You can give a one-time donation to me as well. So much love. You guys you're unironically helping pay for my college. So, and then, links in the description for that. And then also the Majesty of Reason podcast reminder. So the plan is that 2 podcasts will be uploaded per week, and it's just going to be audio versions of my videos. And we're going to be going through each of my past videos and, turning those into audio format and then uploading them on the podcast. So, anyway, we have one episode. I have one episode up so far, and the link is right here. Finally, follow Majesty of Reason on social media like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. It's not me you're interacting with, by the way. That's important to note. I myself don't like social media. I don't enjoy it. The only thing that I use is Facebook, and that's kind of like my personal Facebook thing, and even then, I get on it like once a week so that I can check my notifications. Anyway, I think it's a far too stressful world. When you log on to social media, you're basically injecting cringe into yourself. Like that's really what you're doing. So anyway, it's too cringy. But one of my friends is operating the accounts. So and you can get updates there. You can get other access to things. What better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmidt. This is The Majesty of Reason. And peace out.